G'day, my name is Chris Savage from Ireland Ministers in Australia. I'm welcoming you to this session of Israel Past, Present and Future. We're into session 17. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Now, last session we finished off where we're in the Israel future. We saw where in the final restoration, Israel will be united as a nation, the two sticks joined together. They'll then become the center of Gentile attention. Israel will rule over the Gentiles, and that was the fact that was actually part of God's promises to Israel right back in the book of Deuteronomy, that Israel would be the head over the Gentiles. We also saw that part of Israel's final restoration is going to bring righteousness, holiness, peace, security, all the joy and gladness, all the wonderful things of the kingdom. And we're going to continue on here now, and we're looking still Israel in the future and Israel and the Messianic kingdom, and we're looking at the Millennial mountain of Jehovah's house. Now, at the time of Messiah's second coming, Israel will undergo some tremendous geographical and topographical changes in the land. And one of the key changes, and that's part of the tribulation. And one of the key changes will be the rise of a mountain that will become the highest mountain in the world. And at the summit of this mountain will be Jerusalem with the Millennial temple. Now, several passages speak of this mountain. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 to 4, it speaks about it being the highest mountain in the world. Isaiah 27, verse 13 says it's going to be the center of worship. This is a center of all nations coming to worship. Isaiah 56, 6 to 8 says it's a place of prayer for Jews and Gentiles alike. In Isaiah 66, 20, it says, and they shall bring all your brethren, this is all the Jews, out of all the nations for an oblation, an offering unto Jehovah. So it's going to be this high mountain where Jerusalem is, will now be the center of Israel's regathering. Minor prophet Micah 4, 1 to 2, he says it's the highest mountain in the world, and this is where the law of God is going to proceed out of it. So these passages point out that this is going to be the highest mountain in the world, and it will become the center of both Jewish and Gentile attention and worship. The prophet that received the most revelation regarding the mountain of Jehovah's house was Ezekiel. Now, he speaks about it in Ezekiel 17, verses 22 to 25. He gives us a description of this mountain. In Ezekiel 20, 40 to 41, he tells us it's the center of Jewish worship. In Ezekiel 40, verses 1 to 4, he speaks about the mountain and the city. And then in Ezekiel 45, verses 1 to 8, he speaks about the holy oblation, holy offering. Putting all these passages together, we discover that at that time in the future, pray God it's not that far away, at that time in the future, the mountains will become the highest mountain in the world and will be subdivided into 3 units, each having a special segment that will play a role in the Messianic kingdom. This holy mountain is referred to as the holy oblation. Why? Because the temple is to stand somewhere on this mountain, as is the city of Jerusalem. Now, in Ezekiel 48, 8 to 22, he speaks of this holy oblation. So this very high mountain will itself have a 50-mile square plateau on top, 50 miles square. And this square will be subdivided into 3 sections. 50 miles is around about 85 kilometers, 85 kilometers square. The northern section will be 20 miles by 50 miles, having in its center the Millennial temple, which will be 1 mile square. I have just an image of this just coming up. So this is just a description. The rest of the area of this northern section of this high mountain will be reserved for living quarters for a certain group of priests. Yeah, the priests who are going to occupy this area around the temple are the descendants of Zadok. And because that segment of the tribe of Levi, they were the ones who remained faithful while the rest of the Levitical tribe went astray. They will be responsible for and be in charge of the sacrificial system in the Messianic kingdom. The central section of the plateau will also measure 20 miles by 50 miles. And this area will be reserved for the rest of the tribe of Levi, those Levites who did not belong to the line of Zadok. Remember, Zadok, he comes from the line of Aaron, the priestly line. Their responsibility will be to serve as caretakers of the temple. The southern section is to measure 10 miles by 50 miles, in the middle of which the millennial Jerusalem is to be built. Jerusalem is going to be in the very center of this southern section and will measure 10 miles by 10 miles. That's the city of Jerusalem. The two remaining portions of the southern section, east and west of Jerusalem, will each measure 10 miles by 20 miles and will be for the purpose of growing food for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Jerusalem will not belong to any particular tribe, but it will be inhabited by members of all of the 12 tribes of Israel. Here's just a bit of a, so we see here this holy mountain. This is the Holy Oblation here. We see that it is 50 miles square. Northern section we have there is where the temple is, and the temple itself is 1 mile square, a 1 mile square temple. So, so that just gives us an idea. The sons of Zadok inhabit the northern section, and then the midsection, the Levites, and then the lower section is where we have food growing along with the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so now we look at the Millennial Temple, which we find, and this Millennial Temple, now this is going to be the fourth Jewish temple. So far, we've seen two Jewish temples have come and they've passed into history. The third temple that will be built will be the Tribulation Temple, but this is not a temple that the Lord will sanctify, that sanction. So this fourth temple here will be the Millennial Temple, which will be the fourth Jewish temple, and Ezekiel describes this to us in Ezekiel 40, verses 5 to Ezekiel 43, verse 27. In this passage, Ezekiel gives a lot of detail as to what the Millennial Temple is going to look like and how it will be constructed. We're certainly not going to go through it all. It's just far too much. It will be the largest and it will be the most beautiful temple Israel has had so far. It's impossible to make any sense of this passage where he describes it when reading it, if one reads it allegorically, right? Because there's so much detail given here, as in the construction of the tabernacle and the construction of the first temple. So if there's that much description and both those two were built earlier on, the tabernacle and the first temple, well, this is going to be built as well. So the historical books will become meaningless if those measurements were not meant to be taken literally. The same thing then must be said about this prophetic passage in Ezekiel. To allegorize the details is to render the whole text meaningless, and it is not meaningless. It is going to be built exactly like this. And this is just a bit of a sketch for you to see the temple. It's just showing you the temple. That's all. Huge. It's huge. As I said, it's 1 mile square. Okay. Now we're going to have a millennial system of priesthood and sacrifice as well. And the 3 chapters that deal with this are chapters 40 to 43 of Ezekiel. And this covers the various laws regulating the millennial system of priesthood and sacrifice. Just to summarize it, what we're going to see is that there'll be a sacrificial system instituted in the millennium that will have some features similar to the Mosaic system, along with some new laws. For that very reason, the sacrificial system of the millennium must not be viewed as a reinstitution of the Mosaic system, because it is not. It'll be a brand new system that will contain some things old and some things new, and it will be instituted for an entirely different purpose. A common argument against taking these verses literally is the question as to why such a system would be necessary, since the Messiah has already died. Well, if his death was the final sacrifice for sin, how could these animal sacrifices provide an expiation for sin? Well, if these chapters are supposed to be taken literally, Ezekiel provided a lot of detail that would suddenly become meaningless. sorry, if they were not supposed to be taken literally, it would all be meaningless. However, if all the detail that is intended to be, if all that detail is intended to be symbolic, then the symbols are never explained. And those who take the Bible non-literally are then forced to be subjective in expounding them and must resort to guesswork. The literal approach to what Ezekiel writes in these passages is the safest method to gain an understanding of these passages. Take it literally. Now, in answering the question about the purpose of Ezekiel's sacrifices in light of Messiah's death, we need to remember that the sacrificial system of the Mosaic law did not remove sins either. And we find that in Hebrews 10, verse 4. The Mosaic sacrifices only covered sin. And that's what the meaning of atonement is in Hebrew. It's a covering. So the Mosaic sacrifices were to serve as a physical and visual picture of what the Messiah would do. Isaiah 53, 10 to 12 tell us that. The church has been commanded to keep the Lord's Supper as a physical and visual picture of what Messiah did on the cross. God intends to provide for Israel in the kingdom a visual and physical picture of what the Messiah has accomplished on the cross. For Israel, however, it will be a sacrificial system instead of communion with bread and wine. The purpose of the sacrificial system in the kingdom will be the same as the purpose of communion in the church. It will be done in remembrance of Yeshua, in remembrance of him. The Millennial River, well, altogether, this is another thing in the kingdom. Altogether, there are 3 passages that speak about the Millennial River. And one of these is the passage in Ezekiel 40 to 43, which depicts the river as beginning in the temple area and eventually making its way south to the Dead Sea. The entire Ezekiel passage is summarized in Joel chapter 3, verse 18. And it shall come to pass in that day that the mountains shall drop down sweet wine, and the hills shall flow with milk, and all the brooks of Judah shall flow with waters. And a fountain shall come forth from the house of Jehovah, and shall water the valley of Shittim. According to Joel, the Millennial River will originate in the temple area. Now, the point of the origin is further described by Ezekiel in Ezekiel 47, verses 1 to 2. From the right side of the altar, which will stand at the front of the temple by the threshold of the door, the Millennial River will gush out. It will first head east until it passes the eastern gate and then head south toward the Dead Sea. It's not going to flow directly from the temple to the Dead Sea, but it will first flow down to Jerusalem as depicted in Zechariah 14, verse 8. And while the river will begin in the temple, it is clear from this passage that it will flow southward to Jerusalem, where it will be divided into 2. Since the eastern branch empties into the Dead Sea, the character of the Dead Sea will change. It will begin swarming with life, as prophesied in Ezekiel 47, verses 8 to 10. The western branch will flow down the mountain and empty into the Mediterranean Sea. The eastern branch flows into the Dead Sea. The branching out of these waters toward the areas designated for growing food on both sides of Jerusalem will then provide the necessary food, water for the growth of crops. So here's a temple, that little square up there underneath where it says temple. River flows out to our right, and it goes down into Jerusalem, the city, and then it branches left and right. One side goes, eastern side goes into the Dead Sea, western side goes into the Mediterranean Sea. I'm trying to use my mouse to point to things, but I don't think you see my mouse. Now, the millennial is Israel. We see this We see this in Ezekiel, again in Ezekiel 47 to 48. Now, for the first time in Israel's history, the Jews will possess and settle in all of the promised land, which again be subdivided into the 12 tribal segments. However, these tribal segments will be different from those described in the book of Joshua. Ezekiel states that the division of all the promised land will be the final fulfillment of God's covenant promise or covenant promises in Ezekiel 47 verses 13 to 14. The prophet then deals with the boundaries of the land in the millennium in Ezekiel 47 verses 15 to 20. The northern border will extend from the Mediterranean Sea, incorporating much of modern-day Lebanon and parts of modern Syria. And it will then go across to the east, to the Euphrates River in verses 15 to 17. The eastern border will extend south from the Euphrates River, incorporating the Golan Heights and portions of Syria almost up to Damascus. And it will continue south to the Jordan River, where it then will exit from the Sea of Galilee. The border will then run along the river all the way down to the southern end of the Dead Sea, verse 18. The southern border will be from the southern end of the Dead Sea, which is down there, a Gad down there in that diagram, and it will incorporate the Negev and parts of Sinai all the way along the brook of Egypt, the modern day Wadi El Arish, to the point where it reaches the Mediterranean Sea in verse 19. And the Mediterranean Sea will serve as the western border. Ezekiel 48, 1 to 7 describes the northern division of the land as subdivided for 7 of the 12 tribes. The tribes will be settled running from north to south in the following order. In verse 1, we have Dan at the northern end. Then we have Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Ephraim, Reuben, and Judah. So this is the northern division of the 7 tribes. Ezekiel 48 verses 8 to 22 describes the holy oblation, which is Jerusalem, which we discussed earlier. But now Ezekiel, he notes the exact location of this mountain of Jehovah's house. The mountain of the holy oblation will be situated south of Judah's border and north of Benjamin's border, and will serve as the dividing line between the northern 7 tribes and the southern 5 tribes. Ezekiel 48, 23 to 29 goes on to describe the division of the land for the remaining 5 tribes. Again, running from north to south, which we're now south of Jerusalem. The tribes will be settled in the following order. We have Benjamin, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun, and Gad. And then running along the southern border, we see that in verses 28 to 29 of Ezekiel 48. The millennial Jerusalem, we see Ezekiel describes the millennial Jerusalem, and he gives us some more details here, which none of the other prophets speak about. All 4 sides of the city are described, along with the gates and their names. The city gates will be named after the 12 sons of Jacob. The north side, which we find in Ezekiel 48 verses 30 to 31, will measure 10 miles. And the three gates will be named after Reuben, Judah, and Levi. Eastern side, we've got a picture in the next image. The eastern side will measure 10 miles, and its gates will be named after Joseph, Benjamin, and Dan. The southern side will measure 10 miles, and with its 3 gates named after Simeon, Issachar, and Zebulun. Finally, the western side will also measure 10 miles, with its gates named after Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. Remember, this is the city of Jerusalem. It's 10 miles square. So the total measurement of the city will be 10 miles square, according to Ezekiel 48, verse 35. So here is just an image. So we see the river coming down from the temple up the north. It comes down, it enters the city of Jerusalem, branches left and right into the growing areas for food. And here we have all the gates. Northern gates, Reuben, Judah, Levi, eastern, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun down south, and then Gad, Asher, Naphtali on the west. Now, continuing with millennial Jerusalem, Jerusalem's name will be changed to Jehovah Shammah, which means Jehovah is there, in verse 35 of Ezekiel 48. Since the Messiah will personally reign from Jerusalem, the city will not only fulfill the meaning of its original name, which is a city of peace, but also the meaning of its new name, which is Jehovah Shammah, which means Jehovah is there. For this reason, the city will also be called Jehovah our righteousness, according to Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 16. Other passages give further descriptions of this millennial Jerusalem. Psalm 48, verses 1 to 10, describes it as a city of the great king. Verses 1 to 3 tells us it's the residence of the God of Israel. Verse 8 says God will establish this city. Verse 11, God will dwell in and judge from Jerusalem. Verses 12 to 13, inhabitants are encouraged to study the beauty of this city. And the purpose is to tell their children. Psalm 87, verses 1 to 7 states that only in the millennial kingdom will Jerusalem be known as a city of God in the real sense of the term, and peace will characterize a city in every aspect. In Psalm 122, verses 1 to 9, the Davidic throne will be established in that city, and Yeshua the Messiah will reign from there. According to Psalm 147, verses 1 to 20, Jerusalem will be built at the time of Israel's regathering in verses 2 to 3 of Psalm 147, and will be characterized by strength and peace in verses 12 to 14, and the place from where millennial law will emanate in verses 15 to 20. Among the major prophets, Isaiah had a lot to say about the future of Jerusalem. In Isaiah chapter 1, verses 26 to 27, he described the millennial city as being characterized by holiness, justice, and righteousness. In Isaiah 4, verses 3 to 6, he emphasized that holiness will characterize the establishment of Jerusalem, for all of the city's previous sins will now be purged by God's justice and refining fire, according to Isaiah 4, verse 4. Hence, the visible form of God, the Shekinah glory, will be over the entire Mount Zion in Isaiah 4, verses 5 to 6. In Isaiah 14, verse 32, Jerusalem will serve as a place of security for the afflicted people. In Isaiah 33, verses 20 to 24, again, Isaiah describes the millennial Jerusalem. Quietness and security will characterize a city in that day. For Jehovah, in the person of the Messiah, will dwell there, in verse 21 of Isaiah 33. It will be a city of many streams and waters, but without any ships of war ever sailing in them, in verse 21, the second part. The Messiah will serve as a judge, lawgiver, king, and savior in the midst of the city. And so all Israel's sins will be totally forgiven in Isaiah 33, verses 23 to 24. The holiness and freedom of Jerusalem are emphasized again in Isaiah 52, verses 1 to 2. Jerusalem in that day will become the holy city, and nothing unholy will ever enter into it, in verse 1 of Isaiah 52. It'll be further characterized by freedom, for the times of the Gentiles will be no more, and never again will Jerusalem be subject to bondage, in verse 2. In Isaiah 52, verses 7 to 10, there's good news that is to be declared to Jerusalem. The good news for Jerusalem is that Messiah will reign in Zion, in verse 7, and the Jews will be regathered to Jerusalem, in verse 8. Jerusalem will be built all over again, for God will redeem the city, in verse 9, and salvation will characterize it, in verse 10. This is all in Isaiah 52. Jerusalem is to become the center of worldwide attention, according to Isaiah 60, verses 10 to 14. The Gentiles, who will be servants of Israel, will also be used in building the city, in verse 10. Now, the 12 gates named after the 12 sons of Jacob will be continually open, never to be closed throughout the kingdom. The Gentile nations and kings will bring their tribute through these gates. For failure to do so will bring swift judgment, in verse 12. The Gentile nations that in the past afflicted Jerusalem will now bow in submission to its authority, in verses 13 to 14 of Isaiah 60. A rather detailed description of the millennial Jerusalem is in Isaiah 62, verses 1 to 12. The city will be characterized by brightness and righteousness. Her righteousness will be recognized by all the nations of the earth. Verse 2, at that time, Jerusalem will be given a new name, a brand new name, which is the one mentioned back in Ezekiel 48:35, Jehovah Shammah. Jerusalem will be further characterized by beauty in verse 3, never again to be forsaken or desolated by God in verse 4, for the city itself will be God's joy and delight in verses 4-5. Make sure that these promises will someday be fulfilled. Angelic messengers have been placed upon the walls of Jerusalem, whose entire ministry consists of reminding God of his promises to make Jerusalem the joy and praise of the whole earth in verses 6-7 of Isaiah 62. They're currently there today, reminding God of his promises. The inhabitants of millennial Jerusalem are promised that they will enjoy the fruits of their labors, for the results of their labor will never again be taken away by their enemies in verses 8 and 9. The declaration is made that the redemption and salvation of Jerusalem are assured because God is one who keeps his promises in verses 10-12. Joy and rejoicing will be prominent characteristics of the millennial Jerusalem, according to Isaiah 65:18-19. Peace and comfort along with joy are features of the city. Isaiah 66:10-14. Though Isaiah is the primary major prophet describing the millennial Jerusalem, others spoke of it as well. In Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 17, the re-established Davidic throne will be situated in Jerusalem, making it the center of Gentile attention. It will also be the center of Jewish attention, in Jeremiah 31, verse 6. The increased size of Jerusalem, its holiness, and its indestructibility are the points of Jeremiah 31, verses 38-40. The peace and joy that will return to Jerusalem are described in Jeremiah 33, verses 9-11. The joy, peace, and glory of Jerusalem will now attract the Gentile nations from afar, verse 9. All the former desolations of Jerusalem will be forgotten forever, verse 10. For the streets of Jerusalem will bustle with the noise of joy and gladness and with the happy voices of brides and bridegrooms, verse 11. Now, scattered among the minor prophets are more references describing the millennial Jerusalem. The city will be characterized by holiness and security only because God himself will dwell in her, according to Joel chapter 3, verse 17. So shall you know that I am Jehovah your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. It is from Jerusalem that God will reign over the regathered Israel, according to Micah chapter 4, verses 6-8. In verse 7, he says, and Jehovah will reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth even forever. According to Zephaniah 3, verses 14-17, Jerusalem is to shout for joy and gladness in verse 14. For the city will be redeemed in verse 15. God himself will dwell there in verses 15-17 and reign over the inhabitants of the city. Of all the minor prophets, Zechariah had the most to say concerning the millennial Jerusalem. In the very first chapter of his book, in Zechariah chapter 1, verses 14-17, the prophet reported a promise God made that he has every intention of choosing Jerusalem in spite of the desolations afflicted on her by the Gentiles. He also promised to rebuild the city. And then moving on in Zechariah chapter 2, verses 1-5, the prophet elaborates on the promises made in the previous section. Jerusalem will indeed be rebuilt to a size far greater than ever before in verses 1-2 of chapter 2. The rebuilding is portrayed as a city without walls in verses 3 and 4. It doesn't state that there will be no walls, as if to contradict other passages studied in this chapter. It simply says, as villages without walls. Now, purpose of walled cities is for protection and security. However, the millennial Jerusalem will not need such a wall of protection, since the Messiah himself will dwell in her midst, and the Shekinah glory in the form of fire will surround the city in verse 5 of Zechariah 2. The point is restated again in Zechariah 2:10-12. God in the person of Messiah will indeed dwell in Jerusalem. In verse 10, and for this reason, the city will be the center of worldwide Gentile attention. And from his throne in Jerusalem, the Messiah will reign over all Israel and the Holy Land, in verse 12. Therefore, the purpose of Jerusalem's wall will not be for protection and security, but for beauty. It is for beauty. It is for looking at. It's to attract your attention. Another graphic description of the millennial Jerusalem is Zechariah 8, verses 1-9. We see God's special jealousy for Jerusalem in verses 1-2 of chapter 8, Zechariah. And it's going to cause him to return to the city to dwell in her midst, according to verse 3. And at that time, Jerusalem will become the city of truth upon the mountain of Jehovah's house. The city will be inhabited by the very young and the very old, in verses 4 and 5. The very young will be those who will be born in the kingdom, while the very old will indeed be very old, for many will be several hundred years of age in the closing centuries of the millennium. The millennial Jerusalem will be a marvelous work that only God can do, according to verse 6 of Zechariah 8. And once the millennial Jerusalem is established, it will be inhabited by the Jews regathered from all over the world, in verses 7 and 8. Jerusalem will become the center of worldwide Gentile attention, which is again the point of Zechariah chapter 8, verses 20-22. The unique situation of Jerusalem in the kingdom is described in Zechariah 14, verses 9-11. The Messiah will be king in the city, according to verse 9, and the geography of the land will be greatly altered so that Jerusalem can be enlarged and exalted on the mountain of Jehovah's house, in verse 10. Only then will Jerusalem truly become the city of peace, and its inhabitants live in total security, in verse 11, Zechariah 14. Finally, the holiness that will characterize Jerusalem will extend to the very bells upon the horses and to the pots and pans in the kitchens, according to Zechariah 14, verse 20-21. The entire city will be holy. Throughout the Messianic kingdom, all Israel will be a saved nation. Therefore, in the kingdom, all Israel will also be the remnant of Israel throughout that period. Everything said in the preceding section about Israel and the kingdom will be true of that remnant. However, certain verses do emphasize the remnant motif in the Messianic kingdom, and so we're going to have a look at them. Concerning the regathering of Israel, Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11 and verse 16, picture it as the gathering of the remnant. The same is true in Zechariah 8, verses 6-7. Micah 4, verse 7, emphasizes the salvation of the remnant. This means that the sins of the remnant will be forgiven, which we find in Micah 7, 18-20. And this will also mean then that the remnant will spread the word of God among the Gentile nations, Micah 5, verses 7-8. This is a little bit the remnant. The remnant will also be in possession of the land, which we find in Zechariah 2, verses 7 and verse 9. The same point is made by Zechariah 8, verse 12. The Jewish people will be sinless in the land and live in security, Zephaniah 3, verse 13. Zechariah 8, verses 6-7, the remnant will be regathered, or will be regathered. Zechariah 8, verse 12, the remnant will possess the land. So this is the believing remnant. Well, it can only be the believing remnant because they're the only ones in the kingdom. Now, Israel, future Israel, and the eternal order. What's this all about? Well, even in the eternal state, this is when we move out of the 1,000 years into the eternal state. Even in the eternal state, the Jewish distinctive will be somewhat maintained. However, there is no clear indication if the distinctive includes any functional differences, but there will be a distinction. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22-24, which describes the various residents of the heavenly Jerusalem, it distinguishes the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are the church saints, from the spirits of just men made perfect, which are the Old Testament saints. The Old Testament saints were just or righteous in their day because they were justified by faith. Genesis 15:6 tells us that Abraham believed in Jehovah and he reckoned it to him for righteousness. So Abraham's faith was exercised in Jehovah, and that's how he was justified. But all the Old Testament saints were made perfect at the death of the Messiah. The 12 gates of the eternal New Jerusalem will be named after the 12 tribes of Israel. Revelation 21:12-13 tells us this. Meaning, what does that mean? It means that for all eternity, these Jewish names will be remembered. In verse 12 and 13 of Revelation 21, it had a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, and the south 3 gates, on the west 3 gates. So these will be there for all eternity with the names on them. In Revelation 21, verses 24-26, and the nations shall walk, nations, Gentiles, and the nations shall walk amidst the light thereof, and the kings of the earth bring their glory into it, and the gates thereof shall in no wise be shut by day, for there shall be no night there. And they shall bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it. So, through these gates, the righteous of the Gentiles will bring their glory into it. The Gentiles, the nations, were also mentioned in verse 24, which we just looked at. The mention of Gentiles here shows that the Jewish and Gentile distinction will be maintained for all eternity. Now, we're going to look at a couple, there's more than a few other relevant topics here. We're just going to cover a couple of them in this session, because some of them are very long. So, okay, there are issues here related to Israelology that can't be conveniently categorized as past, present, or future. Remember, we've been looking at Israel past, present, and future, either because they're timeless or because they fit in all 3 time periods. Now, these topics are the symbolic illustrations of Israel in the scriptures. That's one, what we're going to look at. And we're going to look at anti-Semitism, and then we're going to look at the influence of Israelology, the study of Israel, on the other divisions of systematic theology. We're going to get to them so that we have more than a few sessions to go. Okay, we're going to look at, first up, the symbolic illustrations of Israel. The Bible gives a number of symbolic illustrations of the church and her relationship to the Messiah, such as bridegroom and bride, head and body, shepherd, sheep, vine branches, and several others. Now, these are usually found in works on the topic of ecclesiology, which is the study of the church. The Bible also gives symbolic illustrations of Israel that rightly must be studied in a work on Israelology. And these, the following, we're going to look at some of them here. These are topics that relate Israel to God. The first one is the Son of God. Israel, the nation of Israel, is the national Son of God according to Exodus chapter 4, verses 22-23. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, thus saith Jehovah, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And I have said unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And thou hast refused to let him go. Behold, I will slay thy son, thy firstborn. So what we see in Exodus 4, 22-23, the message Moses was to give Pharaoh was that Israel is God's firstborn son. Israel, the national Israel, is God's firstborn son. And it was because of that relationship that the 10th plague hit Egypt, the slaying of the Egyptian firstborn. It was because of that sonship relationship that the Exodus experience occurred, and God called his son out of Egypt. Hosea 11, verse 1, it says this. Hosea is a minor prophet. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. So again, we see that Israel is the son of God. The nation, Israel, the nation, is the son of God. Since Israel is already the son of God in Exodus 4, This sonship cannot be based on the Mosaic covenant. Why? Because the Mosaic covenant had not yet been made. So it must therefore be based on the previous Abrahamic covenant. And for that reason, Israel had the right to address God as Father, which we see in passages like Isaiah 63, verse 16, and Isaiah 64, verse 8. For thou art our Father, it says. But even though Israel was the national son, Israel often proved to be a rebellious son, according to Isaiah chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, and Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 22. The second thing we look at is God's treasure. The second illustration of Israel, God's treasure. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 5, it says, "You shall be my treasured possession among all peoples." So as Israel arrived at Mount Sinai, God decreed Israel to be his own peculiar treasure, mined from among all peoples. He dug her out from all the nations. This point is repeated in Deuteronomy 14, verse 2. The Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession. In Psalm 135, verse 4, for the Lord has chosen Jacob for himself, Israel for his own possession. The psalmist declared that God has chosen Israel for himself and made Israel his own treasure. Israel became God's treasure as a result of her national election, which in turn caused God to rescue his treasure from Egypt. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 44, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. The mystery kingdom that Jesus was speaking about is compared to a treasure hidden in the field. The point of this parable that Jesus gave is that during the period of the mystery kingdom, God will maintain a remnant from Israel, because Israel is his treasured possession, his own possession. And then we see the kingdom of priests. Part of Israel's calling was to be a kingdom of priests. In Exodus 19, verse 6, Moses writes here, "And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests." This is what God was saying about the nation of Israel. The function of a priest is to represent man to God. Israel had only one priestly tribe, the tribe of Levi, set apart from the other tribes to represent the nation to God. But the nation, Israel, as a whole, was to be a holy nation set apart from other nations in order to be a priestly nation to represent other nations, the Gentile nations, to God. That was Israel's national responsibility. Now, as a nation, Israel failed in this calling, but the remnant of Israel did not, because First Peter chapter 2, verses 5 and 9 tell us this. Peter, talking to new believers, Jewish believers, he says, "You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." That's verse 5. And again in verse 9, Peter says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation." He's talking to the believing remnant of Israel, and that they are the ones who are faithful and fulfilled this particular illustration of being a kingdom of priests. And that is where we're going to leave it for this session. Study hard, grow strong, and we'll see you again in a week's time. Thanks for coming along.